Hello, Joseph. How are you?
Well, Rochelle, how are you?
Is it Monday or Friday?
I have no idea. It's just a blur.
Exactly. Your days are starting to run together.
It's just a constant flow, a river.
Are you teaching on campus or remotely this fall?
I think we'll be I honestly don't know, but for me, I could do either one. I've only got a seminar. It's easy to do remote, so I think I'll probably be remote.
Yeah, that
But
makes sense. Yeah.
I've told Liz I'll do whatever they ask me to do. I respect so much how much work they've got to do and how many hard decisions they've got to make, and I trust them to make the right one.
Absolutely. Well, this is really a pretty short I'm going to ask you one question, and all the other questions that I'll ask will flow from your responses. So I'm going to ask you to share a little bit about us to help us get to know you, including your name, maybe what you do, your family, anything you want to share that will help us get to know Joseph Blocher.
Sure. So I'm Joseph Blocher. I'm a law professor here at Duke. I've been teaching here, gosh, for more than 10 years now, which is kind of amazing. Part of my family history anyway, I was born and raised right here in Durham. In fact, I am talking to you right now from a house where I live, which is across the street from the old Watts Hospital, which is where my mom went to nursing school. She was a nurse, and my brother and I grew up mostly with her, and she did fantastic, incredible hard work. HIV/AIDS, home health, inpatient child psychiatric work. It really sort of set a high standard for the rest of us to be able to tackle hard problems. She could do it. We wanted to do it too.
I think you've done very good at helping her tackle hard problems, because you are.
We try, but it's funny sometimes. One of the issues I work on as a professor are issues related to gun violence, and that tends to spark strong feelings, and I get a lot of crazy mail and a lot of sometimes just outright hateful mail. I recently got one that was just swastikas all over it, and I think, gosh, that hurts. But on the other hand, I didn't have to face in my daily life the same emotional toll that even my mom did, who was healthy and safe, but still, dealing like day in, day out with life and death. And so for me anyway, that says we are blessed, those of us who get to do what I do. And so, we should do it as well as we can.
Is Watts, well, at the time she worked there, was Watts a Black or multiracial hospital, or was it just a Black hospital?
She was in the first integrated class of the nursing school there. And so, she passed, unfortunately, 11 years ago. So I have not been able to pump her for stories about this. But what I remember from when I was a kid anyway, was that she was close friends with some of the first, they were Black at that time, Black nurses to join. As you probably know, since we've talked about Durham history and things before, the history of the hospitals here and the fights to integrate them. And, that's a fascinating and important history. Lincoln Hospital, one of the most amazing institutions here in Durham. And Watts was certainly at the center of that.
Absolutely. So from what I know, you teach mostly Constitution.
That's true. Yes. I teach mostly constitutional law. I teach property. I teach classes on the death penalty and on, it's been a few years since I've taught that one, and on the Second Amendment and gun rights and regulation. And I teach a class on law and the history of Durham, which is always a fascinating class to teach, and lets me, really engage with my hometown in a sort of intellectual and personal way. And I'm always so impressed with how much the students really deep dive on that class. I had a student, I just have to brag on one of my students. I just got an email from him. He has an article, the paper he wrote for my class is now getting published. It was about Duke's use of racially restrictive covenants, because Duke University, when it started making houses and selling off houses in Duke Forest, inserted racially restrictive covenants into the deeds of the houses that they were selling, and then continued to do so for 20 years after the Supreme Court said in Shelley versus Kramer that those kind of covenants aren't enforceable. That's just, I'm pretty cynical sometimes, and even I was surprised by that. Unbelievable.
And those covenants mean that they could not sell to people of color, or only a certain number of people of color could be in any given neighborhood, things like that.
That's absolutely right. And you see the same thing all over Durham. And, you can still look at, in fact, when I teach that Durham history class, I often will show, if I were more adept, I could do a quick screen share right now and show a map of the redlining map from Durham in 1937 and then compare it to the racial dot map of Durham based on the 2010 census. And there's some things that haven't changed much. There are some neighborhoods which are still just overwhelmingly white, some neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly black. There's a much, much larger Hispanic and Asian population. And so the overall demographics have shifted a lot, but there's still these neighborhoods by neighborhoods which are just blocked off. I'm a few blocks over from Walltown, which remains, it was sort of, traditionally black neighborhood, still overwhelmingly so. I live in Watts Hillendale, which was, predominantly white and still overwhelmingly so. That's just, that stuff takes just so much to dissolve.
Right. In your neighborhood where you live now and where you grew up, did you ever feel unsafe?
That's a great question. Growing up, I didn't. I grew up right on the line between Durham and Chapel Hill in a very just sort of suburban neighborhood, and physically, I always felt safe. Here, for the most part, I feel very safe. My wife and I are very fortunate. We have a nice house. We like it. But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking actually right now of a recent incident. We had a car accident in front of our house. Two people just happened to run into each other, and then one of them got out of the car, I guess realized he had a gun he wasn't allowed to have, and so threw it into the bushes in front of the house. And the police came, and a few of us who'd seen it said, just a heads up, he threw a gun over there. And you realize, like, we're all subject to different kinds of threats, but threats aren't necessarily as far away as anybody would like to think.
Absolutely. I want to ask you a few questions about the Constitution. And first, I'm asking because I really don't know, but I really want to know what they really mean. So going back to slavery, specifically slavery in the South, 3/5 of a man gave the plantation owner property that would give him so many rights in the legislature or in Congress or with the president. Can you explain that?
You just said it beautifully, Rochelle. I often ask my con law students this question: what was so wrong about the Three-Fifths Clause? And there's a number of things you can say that are obviously wrong about it. But one thing that's almost counterintuitive is that it's unfair that it was 3/5. It would have been better if it was 1/5 or 0/5. Because what the clause did was it was part of calculating how many people lived in a state for purposes of representation in the House of Representation. So the more you have, the more power you're going to get in the House of Representatives, right? What the Three-Fifths Clause said was that you get to count 3/5 of all other persons, meaning essentially enslaved persons, right? Mm-hmm. That's unfair for precisely the reason you said, is that it artificially inflates the number of people, like people who are treated as citizens living in the South. And so that, slave owners or people living in states that had slavery had this artificially strong voice in Congress because they got to count as if they were being treated as people, the human beings who they were owning as property. Mm-hmm. And so it sounds perverse, but it's true. It would have been much more just had it been a 0/5 clause. Mm-hmm. Like, it wasn't that the people being treated as less than, they weren't getting legal rights. They weren't being allowed to cast their own votes or being entitled to these other constitutional rights. They really should have been left off the rolls when it came to deciding how much voting power whites in southern states especially would receive. And so, just as you said it, that's what is so perverse about that one part of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. And so being 3/5 of a person, did their wives and children also count as 3/5, or was it just the man, or is there some component to it that's not? I mean, so I know that slave owners were allowed to sell their wives and children away from their families and stuff like that. Did that 3/5 apply to that person that was sold away, even if it was a child?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, the all other persons, for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, would have counted men, women, believe children as well, but I'm not even sure about that. But that wouldn't have had anything to do with, slave owners' power to treat the people who they owned as property. There's a case that I teach in my constitutional law class and in my Durham history class and in my property class, a famous North Carolina case called State versus Mann. Mm-hmm. And it's just this extraordinary case which comes about because one slave owner lends a slave to another slave owner, and then that second slave owner shoots her, like in the course of it was a dispute of some kind, right? And in a normal world, a just world, when one person shoots another person, the standard question would be, was that homicide? You know, but in this case, the question was more like, did this person, this slave owner, deprive this person of property, or does this slave have a legal claim against the person who shot her, like for. And what the Supreme Court of North Carolina holds in an opinion by Justice Iredell, whose name you'll see still all over town. In fact, there's an Iredell Street just a few blocks from where I'm sitting, was that no, the slave can never have a legal claim against his or her master because, and this is quoting, I think directly, pretty sure this is exact, the power of the master must be absolute so as to render the submission of the slave perfect. In other words, you can't have any legal relationship, can't have any legal claim. It was just so, you could sell, you could hurt, you could dominate, you could rape, you could beat, and all of those things happened. There was simply no legal relationship. It was like being treated as a piece of property. And when I teach that in my class, I think for students, some of them are already familiar with this, they kind of already understand, but for some others, it's like, oh, right. Like, what would it mean if there was nowhere you could go when somebody shot you wrongfully? Like, there's nowhere to turn.
Yeah. I read Man.
Oh,
my second or third year. I don't remember all the fine details, but I did read that. A lot of the courses that many of the faculty at the law school, if I heard about it or I saw it, it was relevant to me, I'd ask for a copy or something and get a copy and read it, or either get a location to the site. The law librarians were very, very helpful in giving me access or telling me where to go find the site. So I have read some of that. Let me ask you another constitutional question. So now we're at the Civil War, and the North has allowed escaped slaves to put on a uniform and then eventually carry a gun. If those slaves were captured by Southerners or plantation owners, those people could be lynched or killed. Was there any provision in the Constitution or any provision in any law that gave them, once they were militarized, a voice or a function or an ability other than just to do what they were told?
That is a superb question, Rochelle, and I don't know the answer. That, in other words, if a Black soldier fighting for the Union were captured by, I should know the answer to that, and I don't, and I wish I did. There were a lot of cases of, not necessarily court cases, but lots of incidents where, for example, enslaved persons escaped past the Union lines and then sought protection. Mm-hmm. And there were incidents where Union generals, for example, would claim them essentially as property, which in a weird way made it sort of like a tool of liberation. The way the argument would go was like, okay, you Southerners say that they're property. Well, in a war, if you come across somebody's property, the enemy's property, you can seize it. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take you at your word here, and we're going to keep these people, kind of on our, behind our lines. But I'm not sure about a lot of, legal protections there. I mean, there are plenty of incidents, and some of them well known, some of them made it into movies and things, where Black soldiers fighting for the Union found themselves surrounded by Confederates or captured by Confederates, and the results were horror. I mean, just absolute massacres, Americans massacring Americans, and that stuff. I mean, of course, and this is the part I try to stress to my students, it didn't just end in 1865 when the war ended. I mean, we had massacres. Look at Wilmington here, look at Tulsa, look at, the Colfax massacre in Louisiana, for decades after the Civil War ended, where dozens, 100, or just individually over time, Black Americans are being murdered systematically in the same sort of power establishing kind of a way, I think. So it's a story that, when I teach constitutional law, I spend a lot of time on the Civil War because I think it is, along with the Revolution, maybe the most important moment in American history thus far. It was just like as a constitutional moment anyway. And my experience is usually that, students don't necessarily have a great sense of why it was fought, what it was all about, and they've heard different things. And I tell them, probably what you heard first was right, because at least my experience was growing up, at first you were told it was a war over slavery, and then it was about states' rights, and then it was about cultural differences. No, no, no. It was about slavery. Let's go back to what the actual simple explanation was. That was correct.
Yeah.
States' rights to what? States' rights to own slaves. It all comes back to the single original sin, and we might as well call it for what it is. The Confederate States did. They were clear in their statements of why they seceded. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, very clear that it was for this peculiar institution.
The other day I was watching Grant. The History Channel did a 3-part series on Ulysses S. Grant. I didn't know that they had called him the United States Grant and all these other names. They had made fun of him. I thought it was very interesting. But
it's funny with figures like Grant, that it's hard to know how to, for me anyway, I'll say it's hard to know how to judge them. On the one hand, Grant is, for me, as this kind of a Civil War nerd, like, is kind of a hero, a heroic figure, has his major flaw. On the other hand, with him and even Lincoln, who for me is is maybe the American hero, is the person who I can read any book about, and still, they still do and say things which are just morally reprehensible, especially with regard to race. And I just find it so hard. I mean, I don't know what you think on that. It's so hard to know how to judge. Like, if you're watching that Grant documentary, do you look at this and think, thank goodness he was the sword of liberation in so many ways, the person who made the proclamation real? On the other hand, was his heart, well, where's his heart? I don't know. That's the hard part for me.
The Grant story is really interesting to me because his parents, his elders, were forced abolitionists. They did not believe in slaveholding. When he married the woman he married, I think her family owned slaves, and none of his family attended the wedding, and all of those kinds of things. So it's just very interesting. And the thing about Lincoln, so I think I have every book that's been written about Lincoln, everyone.
There's so many reasons why we're good friends, Rochelle. Like, now I understand one more. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm always questioned by Black and brown people. Do I believe that Lincoln was for or against slavery, or was his position to save the Union? Which one of those is true? And if you look at the documentation, so many people have written about him and given, overviews of who and what they thought they were. Almost every book I read, I leave still confused. I don't know whether he was for the state or whether he was for, freeing the slaves and then giving them a chance. I still don't know. But if you go to my office, I have a picture of him in my office. I have a picture of him in my portfolio. Because I think, and this is something I tell a lot of my Black friends, I don't think you can call all white people racist. I don't. Because if we didn't have white people, Harriet Tubman would not have ended slavery, even if she could have gotten out 1 million Black people out of the South. You needed help, and you needed help from people that did not look like you, people who shared some of the values you did. They may not have seen you as equal, but at least they believed in your cause. So that's what I think about that. So going back to go ahead, Jessica.
I was going to say, it's hard for me. I resonate with so much of what you just said there. But I'll say, like, as a white man, when I project myself back in time and I try to think about, like, where would you have been? What would you have been doing in the 1850s, 1860s? Like, that for me is always the kind of the historical test, because it's easy to say, today, oh, this side was right and this side was wrong. But at the time, like, you have to imagine, like, what are you going to do at the time when, like, the history's not yet written? Like, and you're the one writing it, you're the one with the pen. Like, what's going to be the trigger sort of for you, right? And so what you said about Lincoln, I think, is exactly right. I mean, he says lots of times, if I could preserve the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could preserve while freeing some and not others, if I could, and you look at that statement and you think, well, then where is your heart really? And then, I have this tendency, because I love him, to say, well, he was, given the times, that was really good. But then you look, William Lloyd Garrison, look at John Brown, right? There were people who were capable of astounding moral clarity and willing to literally put their lives on the line for it. And so I don't, again, I love Lincoln. I mean, deeply. But there is a part of me that, as I guess we always should with ourselves, our families, our heroes, like, hold them, like, still question whether they whether they, did everything they could have done. And maybe the answer to that is yes. I don't for a minute think I could have handled anything any better. And thank goodness he was the man for the time. But, it's a hard question.
Yeah. The Emancipation Proclamation is an amazing piece of literature. It is, considering when it was written, it was just absolutely a phenomenal speech. And that's the thing that leads me to believe that there was some goodness in him because of what he wrote. I think as a normal president would, preserving the union would be a very important thing. I mean, nobody wants the North to split from the South or the West to split from the East. I think that would be, hard for any president to digest that. Any normal president. Let me just put that there. Normal, if you know what I mean by normal. That this would happen. So I can see why preserving the union mattered to him as a leader, because not only would he lose half of his constituents, he'd also lose land, which even to this day we equate to wealth. The more property and the more you own, the more assets you have. So, I could see why that was important to him. But then again, there are other little pieces that are just unreasonable to me. But I'm not. You're the person who's supposed to know the answer to all these questions, not me.
I'm sorry, I don't. I will say one other thing about him, which it's maybe to me the most impressive thing about him, just as a personal matter, is that he could kind of he again, not to speak exactly about what's going on with current president and current world, but he kind of understood when things weren't about him.
Yeah.
It's like, you are you fitted to the times? Can you do what's required and not make it about you, and not make it about, your own awakening or your own heroism or anything? And, I think, unfortunately, I don't mind saying it. Like, I think unfortunately we have a president now who can't do that. Everything's about him and everything he responds to. But, maybe more relevant to like the discussions that we're all having right now, I think it's very hard for people who are, I think especially for white Americans who think of themselves as not being racist, to have the conversation about race and not be defensive, like not make it about them. And it's like, this is not just about you. It's not about you as an individual alone. You have responsibilities, but this is a story that's been told for hundreds of years, and you have a role to play, just like Lincoln had a role to play. He didn't make all those problems, but he did his best to solve them. And sometimes people hated him for it, and he sucked up a remarkable amount of hate, and then eventually gave his life. I mean, that, not that that's the sacrifice everyone has to make, but it's not the sacrifice everybody's being asked to make. If you're just being asked to listen, if it's uncomfortable, Lincoln did. If that's your hero, you got to do what he did. So absolutely.
So I'll tell you what I told Barack. I did Barack about an hour ago, and it was very interesting talking to Barack. He's out in California, and I think he says he's coming back to Duke in the fall to teach. I'm a 61-year-old Black woman. I have two adult children, both Black, and I have a Black husband. So everybody in my world, my immediate world, is Black. And each time they leave me, I start praying. And I pray till they arrive at their destination, and I pray till they arrive home, back into the driveway. And when white people have conversations with me, so since Mr. Floyd's death, I'd say probably 30, 40 of my white friends have called me and said, hey, how are you doing? You need anything? What can we do? What? And I thought that was very generous and generous. Whatever, I can't say right this minute, generous. Okay, thank you, I got it out. But more times than not, if we get any deeper than 8 minutes and 46 seconds, you can feel the person starting to squirm, so, and as I was telling Barack, and this is probably true for you too, when you and your wife die, you will leave your children a legacy. You will leave them things that can help them grow their own well-being, their own families, their own wealth. For me, and for many Black and brown people, that's not the case. My mother died when I was 19 years old. I was raised by my father's sister. She's my paternal aunt. She died December 2nd, 1977. And she left me a little small bag, smaller than that, of silver coins, real true silver. She had a 38 gun. I don't know what it is. I don't know how you tell what kind of gun it is. She had a 38. And she had her own birth natural born son, but he was hearing impaired. And that's what she left us. The house that she lived in did not have indoor plumbing, did not have regular running water, no hot water. We had a stove that looked like it was a small engine that we cooked, washed, and bathed. When we needed hot water, we got it from there. You know, we had to go cut up wood and put in it and set the pot on top, and hopefully the pot was strong enough not to melt from the heat from that stove. And you could not touch that stove for hours, even after the water had gotten hot. So, you know, growing up extremely poor, you know, and people ask me now, you know, that this has happened 8 minutes and 46 seconds later, and then Atlanta, Friday, what can they do for me? And my answer is almost always the same. Have those uncomfortable conversations, as uncomfortable as it can be. If someone says, Joseph, you're a racist. I think your teaching leans toward racism, or I think you have discriminated against me. That's why. What is it that they're feeling? Why do they think that? Because I think for white people, and this is a generality, it's not a fact, make certain assumptions that may not be real, you know, that I have a good job, that I'm pretty well off, I can take care of my kids, I can pay my bills. Those are assumptions, they're not facts. And so for Mr. Floyd, Avery, Garner, Brown, Trayvon Martin, the assumptions that people made was that that young Black man could walk to a neighborhood in which he lived and not be tempted to a fight and eventually killed. And I'm talking about Trayvon Martin. Many people probably assumed, especially as white friends and you know, teachers and stuff, thought, oh, nothing's going to happen to him if he goes to the store to get a pack of Skittles. Well, Mr. Floyd, if he did have a counterfeit $20, he died for $20, and whether it was legitimate or not. So I always encourage my white friends to have those difficult conversations and ask questions that you really care about. Because, you know, we have those generic conversations. Hey, how are you? Fine, fine, you know. And those conversations really have no real value. But how are you? You know, how are things going with you? You know, are you stressed? Or how's things at work? You know, how are things with your family? You know, just those conversations are starts that white people can do. Not reach out your checkbook and write a check, you know, not go to the grocery store and buy a bag of groceries. I mean, you could do that. You know, if somebody couldn't go, they couldn't get out, you know, you could do that. But this is not a monetary thing. This is a thing that is just about our mental well-being. And me being a 61-year-old Black woman growing up in the South, I grew up in a little town called Walterboro, South Carolina. I had been called the N-word so many times, I thought it was part of my name. That's how often. I was young when they started calling me, and I did not learn until after I had gotten out of South Carolina that was not okay to be called that. When I went to school, they told me I was never going to be anything but a pregnant woman, with barefoot pregnant Black woman. I was like, okay, that's all I can aspire to. And they told me that Christopher Columbus discovered America, and I believed every word of it. I wrote papers about it. I believed it. And then I leave South Carolina and I go up north where most of my family is in New York, and I discover all this lies. So now how do I reprogram my mind? Because to me, some man sailed in and there was America. No one was here but him, where the Native Americans have been here for generations. So there's that. So that's just my one thing I want to say. I'm off my soapbox now. So back to my constitutional questions.
Well, let me just, can I say one quick thing on that, Rochelle?
Yeah.
Can I just say thanks? I mean, my reaction always, if a student would come to me with some comment like that, you know, of like, you know, you said something in class today that made me feel uncomfortable, that I think you missed the angle that this property case has for race. You know, it's easy when I'm teaching state versus man and we're talking about slavery directly, but I have blind spots when I'm talking about something else, whether it's nuisance law or something else, and I may be missing what other people are picking up as a racial dynamic. I think my first reaction has to be thanks, because that's a hard conversation to start with your professor. And you know, you're a powerful grown woman. You can speak, but I bet it's a hard thing for you to have to, you know, calm, you know, to bring up with me or anybody else, because you know, it's one, if you have to, in your mind, have these feelings and conversations and hopes that your son comes home after he's been out, and the very least I can do is be a little uncomfortable by a student asking me a hard question. I think that's absolutely right. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I will tell you this, many people have asked me, why did I start this? I had looked at this video so many times. I've seen the protest, and I got to the point where I was overwhelmed by it. I can't look at it anymore. And so, you've got all these famous Black people, rich Black people, whatever, on CNN and wherever, talking about what they're talking about. But people like me that are down here in the trenches, I'm a part of the -0%. I'm not rich. I'm not any of those things. And I felt like people like me wanted to have a place to tell their story. You could tell it however you want to tell it. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can admit whatever puts your job in jeopardy. When I started doing this, I realized that this could cost me my job. Duke could fire me just like that for doing this. And the first day or two, I had a little bit of anxiety about, okay, they're going to fire me because this is not what Duke thinks should happen from their brand or what people should say about their institution, so they could fire me. I wrote a letter to President Price over the weekend, and I told him, you should ask your Black staff, maybe even your Black faculty, what they think about Duke. The majority of Black people I know call Duke the plantation. Duke does not know that. They don't know why that is, because they think they're doing great. They're admitting Indian and Asian students. They're admitting Black basketball and football players. They are, talking diversity, all the time. I think I read something back in January or February, Duke ranked high in diversity or something like that. And almost every Black person I talked to had read that article. What Duke this is? This can't be the one that's in Durham, is it? Can it be? Because if you look at our numbers, if you just look at your law faculty, how many law faculty, tenured or untenured, governing or non-governing, are Black or brown? Very small, very small. When I started Duke in 2008, there were 8 Black students, 8. I think we're at the 20 now, at least 15 or 20 for the class of 2020. I'm not exactly sure what the number is. Out of, 200 or 300 students they admit a year or something. I don't know exactly what the number is. That's a sad commentary. It's really a sad commentary. The students have so few Black faculty that look like them and have some of their experiences. So Guy is overworked. Trina is overworked. Jim Coleman is overworked. Thavola Glimp, who comes over and does the John Hope Franklin talks, because they become the go-to persons anytime something Black happens. So change to me has to be that we just don't talk, we do. If someone told me the reason why there are not enough Black faculty or Black administrators is because they don't apply, I can tell you for a fact that's a flat out lie. It's just that we didn't make it through the tracking system, the application tracking system, to get an interview. And if we do get an interview, they've already selected the candidate they had in mind. I don't stand a chance. So going back to the Constitution, one of my favorite things in the world, Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, for a small period of time, gave former enslaved people a voice for a very small period of time. What was wrong with Reconstruction that made it disappear so fast? Why was it just here today and gone tomorrow?
That's a very good question with a long, long answer that even I don't think I'm qualified to give. And all I could do is sort of cite off the scholars who've written the foundational work, including John Hope Franklin, a former, obviously former scholar here at Duke. But I think one thing is that, it illustrates something that for lawyers is sometimes uncomfortable, which is that law only does so much, and that law doesn't immediately change social norms and values and character. And so, the backlash among segregationists, white supremacists, which continued and in pockets continues today, wasn't going to be eradicated by things like the Civil Rights Acts of the even of the 1800s. We had Civil Rights Acts even in the 1800s. It made me think of something that I was thinking about in response to what you were just saying about Duke, that, the tricky thing is to On here, I can invoke actually the North Carolina state motto, which I actually really like a lot. Our state motto in Latin is esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. Right? You actually have to be a change. You can't just seem a change agent. You have to actually be anti-racist. You can't just seem anti-racist, which I feel like, again, is kind of a conversation people are having a lot right now about what does it mean to be a real ally versus an optical ally? What does it mean to be a country that is really anti-slavery versus a country which, is, purporting to be or seeming to be anti-slavery or anti-subordination? And I think that transformation, it wasn't there, especially in the South, in the immediate aftermath. And, I think actually history is shaped by contingencies. And if certain things had played out differently, who knows? If we'd had a different president than Johnson after Lincoln, who knows? If we hadn't had Thaddeus Stevens, maybe the world would have been even worse. I mean, these are decisions that people make, which is why we today have a responsibility, because we're writing the history for tomorrow. So I don't have a single answer to that question. It's a really good one. But there was a time when things got better and then they got much worse.
Right. Okay, so we're going to leave Reconstruction and we're going to go to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, which is something you're very familiar with. You have a center that deals with this. So first, why was that amendment needed?
Well, it's an excellent question. People still divided on. I'd say there's basically two schools of thought. It was either put there to protect the state militias from being disarmed by the federal government, which the colonists were kind of terrified about. That was for 200 years the predominant view. But since 2008, since right when you joined the faculty and when I did, the Supreme Court has interpreted it to say that it's about an individual right to keep and bear arms against criminals and things like that, like individual self-defense, in other words. So those are the two views. And at least as of now, the second self-defense centered view has held sway. Now it has, the Second Amendment is intertwined and has always been, arms bearing has always been intertwined with issues of race. Guns can be used and have been used as tools of liberation and tools of oppression throughout American history. And I think it's worth noting that, whether it's the Deacons for Defense or the Black Panthers, there are armed groups fighting for Black liberation in the United States, even holding aside the United States Army and the Black troops who fought for the Union in the Civil War. But it's also worth noting that, they remain a tool of death for thousands of young Black men every year. And you mentioned a few earlier, Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery. That's two of about 6,000 every year who are killed with guns. I mean, it is astonishing to me. Homicide is the leading cause of death for Black men 18 to 35, and gun homicides are 86% of those homicides. So when I work on gun rights and regulation, to me, it just feels like what we're witnessing every year is like the number of casualties we would have seen in the Iraq War on the United States side. It's just astonishing. And they're not headline grabbing most of the time. It's usually just a one-off gun homicide. And if there's no videotape, you probably never see it or hear about it. It gets reported as a defensive gun use or self-defense, and nobody else is around to tell the story. And that, that to me is just, it's a remarkable and astonishing and just horrifying fact. But that is the work, that is a lot of the work that I do.
Yeah, but there are countries in the world that have gun laws that prohibit citizens from having guns. Or limit at least the types of guns citizens can have.
Absolutely.
And in those instances, we see less gun violence.
We are a remarkable outlier when it comes to gun prevalence and gun violence. And again, there's complicated reasons for this. And it's not, I don't think, I'm a person who supports more gun regulation. I don't think even changing the laws would change everything overnight, just like we were talking about with Reconstruction. We don't even know how many, but probably 250, 300 million guns in circulation right now in the United States. Like, if you made them all illegal tomorrow, there's still be thousands of people dying as a result of guns. But absolutely, I think gun laws could make a difference. And I think that properly written, the laws that those communities would help probably predominantly are communities of color, because they're the ones who are suffering gun violence the most. Again, the problem of gun homicide is not evenly distributed. It's not people like me being shot. It's young Black men, overwhelmingly, predominantly. It's incredible. Gun suicides, on the other hand, those are people who look like me. That's predominantly white men, especially in rural areas. And that's the majority of gun deaths. So there's still big problems, but they're different, you know.
Right, different groups, different problems.
Different groups, different problems.
Okay, this is an opinion question. Why do you need a gun that can shoot 30, 40, however many bullets at one time versus a single shot, in accordance with the Second Amendment? Why is it legal for me, a homeowner, to own an AK-47 if I can get a gun permit? Or I don't know all kinds of guns, so I don't know very much about all the guns, but I know there are some guns that are single shots, and there are guns that shoot rounds, and so forth and so on. And I know there's a what's the one that shoots buckshot? I can't shotguns.
Shotguns.
No, but why is it necessary for there to be that many and types of guns available to the ordinary citizens? So I understand the military, I even understand the police, but why to you and me?
I wish I had the answer to that question, Rochelle. I've been asking it in my scholarship over the years. The way I'd say it is this: if I were a gun rights advocate, what I would say is this: you never know. You don't know the threats you're going to face. You don't know who's going to come into your house and threaten your family. And what if you miss with your first 6 shots? And what if there's 4 of them? And you feel like you need to have 20 rounds or whatever. I mean, I think it's rare that people have those like 50 round magazines, in an automatic weapon. Automatic being where you just hold down the trigger and it keeps shooting. That's an automatic weapon. Those are rare. It's mostly semi-automatic, meaning one trigger pull means 1 bullet. But there are big fights about what I think of as high capacity magazines being anything over 10 bullets. I mean, if you can't do it in 10 bullets, it strikes me as unlikely that 20 or 30 or 40 is going to do the job without also wounding and killing however many bystanders or family members or whoever else. But courts divide on this kind of stuff. And there was a recent court decision where a district court in California struck down California's limitation on high capacity magazines. And, I think it's just a really regrettable opinion and not a well-reasoned one, but there's division out there. And, for me, it's literally a matter of life and death, getting this question right. And I think, guns do get sometimes used for purposes of self-defense. I think all of us who support regulation have to acknowledge that. Sometimes people really do use guns properly, or they use them for hunting or recreation or whatever else. But I think the gun rights advocates also have to recognize that sometimes even people, when they mean well and they're not motivated consciously by malice, misuse guns and kill people. And they're disproportionately likely to do that when they're looking through the lens of race. I mean, to me, it's not complicated at all. Who's going to be, perceived as a threat and threatened with a weapon? It's of course going to be correlated, not caused by that person's race.
I tell you a story. I don't know if you read about this. I think it's been about 5 or 6 years ago now. I don't know. Young mixed race man, and he wasn't a man. He was a teenager, not over the age of 16, I believe. Lived in a pretty middle class neighborhood. All the houses were cookie cutter, so they all looked alike. And this young man went out with his white friend. After his father told him he couldn't go out, he snuck out. And he and his white friend went to this party. They drank. They did whatever people do at parties, young people do at parties. And when he came home, because all the houses looked so much alike, he pulled up the window that he would normally pull up when he snuck in and out of his house, before, and stuck in the wrong house. Yeah. And the homeowner shot him. I don't know how many times he shot him, but he shot him. The child was inebriated. And my husband and I have this conversation almost every other week. Was that the right thing to do? And my husband always says, well, if somebody breaks in my house, I have to protect my family. I've got to make sure my family's okay. So I'm going to shoot. That's what my husband says. So me, if I felt like I had to shoot, I shoot him in the knee, not in the, not to kill. I do something to get him down so I can get the police, but whatever. And so when you think about guns and gun laws and rules and regulations, I can see how this is a complex issue. I can see how it's not simply solved by, getting rid of guns. One of my white coworkers said he believes he should give everybody in America a gun, but just don't give them any bullets. I said, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Which I thought was pretty humorous, but I did understand his point, So, okay, I'm going back to the Constitution. So now I am a woman. and I want to vote. What does the Constitution say, and has it changed since women were given the right to vote? And I'm going to ask you the same question about Black and brown people too.
Well, I'll try to answer. I can say a little bit about both those things together, because it's, I mean, one thing that's astonishing sometimes to students to learn is that women got the right to vote after freed enslaved persons did. I mean, that freed Black men got the right to vote decades before women did, which is just an astonishing fact. That it's really only been a century since the federal Constitution. It has literally been a century since the federal Constitution guaranteed women the right to vote. And you know, the history there is complicated and depressing and full of, frankly, violence in ways that doesn't always get acknowledged. But that's, you know, that's really only since 1919 that has been a constitutional right for women. Whereas the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and in the case of voting, 15th Amendments guaranteed that people couldn't be denied the right to vote on the basis of race in the late 1860s. So, you know, the ordering there is sometimes, I think, surprising to people, but yeah, that's how long it's been. And again, just with the Civil War, it's not that long ago. A century is not that long.
But for now, and I think I'm correct about this, correct me if I'm wrong, for women, if they had the right identification or whatever was required, they could vote. For Black and brown people, there were poll tax, educational questions, all these things. Even though Blacks were given the right to vote long before women, they had other obstacles to overcome to vote.
That's absolutely true. And I don't know as much about the experience of women trying to vote, like suffragettes trying to vote, trying to exercise their newfound federal right. And I don't know the obstacles they faced in terms of, coercion by their husbands or whatever else. But it's absolutely true that poll taxes, literacy tests, all that kind of stuff persisted for decades and decades and decades after the 15th Amendment. It's that same theme we've been talking about already, that, you know, just because you say it in law or say it in the Constitution doesn't make it so, right? Saying in the Constitution that people, you know, should not be denied the right to vote on the basis of their race certainly didn't mean that the next day Black men in America could then go out and cast ballots on the same, you know, with the same basis as white Americans. I mean, states bent over backwards to avoid that. In North Carolina, even, I mean, it's one of the reasons we had a pretty well-funded public education system for whites, was so that they could pass the literacy tests when Blacks couldn't. I mean, imagine going to the lengths that you would do that in order to disenfranchise part of your population, you know, and that feels like a progressive thing. Like, oh, we spent all this money on education. Well, why were we doing it? Actually, it was in part, at least, to preserve this sort of racial hierarchy.
Absolutely. So, okay. So now we're able to vote. We can carry a gun. We are no longer enslaved. And we can move about the country somewhat safely. I still watch stories about sundowner towns and places where even today, if you're Black, you may be cautious before you go out at night in these states. Okay, so now we're in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. What did the Constitution say about education during slavery, post-Brown versus the Board of Education?
Well, when the Constitution was written, it didn't, and actually technically still doesn't say anything directly about education. What it did start to say something about, at least as of the 1860s, was that you can't discriminate on the basis of race with regard to certain things. And one of those, at least as of 1954, is education. So, you know, to the degree that education was available at all to Black Americans in the, 1700s or 1800s, certainly wasn't going to be on equal terms or in integrated classrooms with whites. That is not even plausible in the vast majority of places. There was money being spent, especially about early 1900s, on Black schools. You had, the Rosenwald schools and things like that. You still actually see them around Durham. But integrating schools was a decades-long legal campaign. And everybody associates it with Thurgood Marshall, rightly so, but there are other heroes of that movement who don't get the recognition they deserve, including, of course, Durham's own Pauli Murray, Charles Hamilton Houston, and Jack Greenberg. There were good, white lawyers working on this too. Here, Floyd McKissick, huge figure in helping to integrate Durham schools, but that was a decades-long process. And even after Brown v. Board, you know, when I teach that case in con law, or when I teach it in my Durham class, I always encourage my students to think, you're a lawyer. What do you do the next day after Brown versus Board is decided? You're in Durham, North Carolina. What do you do? What's the lawsuit you file? What are the interrogatories that you seek? Like the real technical lawyering aspect of it took decades, and in some respects is still ongoing. I mean, you know, as you know, I grew up here in Durham. I went to Durham Public Schools. It wasn't until I was in high school, my freshman year, that they merged the city and county schools. And before that, you had county schools overwhelmingly white, city schools overwhelmingly black. The merger was the only thing that even brought some modicum of integration to the public schools in Durham. And this is late 1990s, and people still fought it tooth and nail. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's, you know, this is, 40 years after Brown versus Board. That's still an ongoing, challenge, I think.
Do you think integration was good for Black people?
I do. I think it's a complicated story, but absolutely. I think, we were talking earlier about Lincoln Hospital. So let me focus on that as an example, right? When people in Durham were fighting to integrate the hospitals, there was an interesting coalition of people opposed to integrating Watts Hospital across the street from me. There were the white supremacist segregationists who didn't want it because they didn't want an integrated institution. And then there were members of the Black community who thought, you know, what's going to happen is we're going to lose Lincoln Hospital, which is a crown jewel of this community, and we're going to get secondary treatment in this supposedly integrated institution. And it is really tough, without playing out the historical counterfactuals, to know if those Black skeptics were right. So I say yes because I'm against segregation in all ways, shapes, and forms. But I think also there's a simplistic, flattening, leveling integration that doesn't recognize the importance and vitality of spaces and institutions and practices that are distinct can be harmful to people who developed an identity and want to preserve it. So that's the only reason I say it's a little bit complicated. But to be clear, integration is certainly better than segregation. I'll put it that way.
I don't know that I agree with you, but I certainly accept that as information. We have about 7 minutes. I'm going to ask my last question, then I'm going to leave the floor for you to say whatever you want to say. So we move closer to current times, affirmative action. What is affirmative action? What was the law intended to do? And why has affirmative action been seen as such a down or bad thing for the larger society?
Well, it's complicated because it can mean a lot of different things. Affirmative action, because it can apply in lots of different contexts. You can have affirmative action for hiring of contractors who are doing, work for a state. You can have affirmative action in college admissions. You can have what's sometimes called affirmative action, or at least race-conscious student assignment plans in K-12 schools. Like, there's all kinds of different ways that word gets used. But I think in its truest sense, what it just means is that, it can't be the case that after centuries of racial oppression and segregation that you just stop actively segregating and assume that sort of society is going to reach a kind of equilibrium that everybody's content with. That actually you do have to take real steps to create the communities that you want to be a part of and that you want your children to be a part of. And that might mean, actively pursuing, engaging students who you want to attend your school, or, actively reaching out to people who have been shut out of work environments where they, never should have been shut out in the first place. That it's just a simple thing of, frankly, like remedy. There has to be a remedy for a long-term wrong, and just status quo is not going to do it. And certainly not going to do it fast enough. So I think that's part of it, of the motivation. There are others. I mean, one is that certain, practices that we all engage in are just better for everyone when the group that's engaged in it is more diverse. So education, good example, right? A classroom is better when there are, more well-informed voices, people who can talk about their experiences, and they're not all the same one. So there's lots of arguments for. So why is it negative? I think some people see it as like essentially a redistribution. They feel like something's being taken from them that they never had. This is, I think some white opponents of affirmative action feel like this is they're being like charged with having received some kind of benefit that they don't really feel like they ever got. And that makes it tough because people have this really strong endowment kind of effect. It's like, once you've got something, to give it up is like harder than who've never had it, is sort of the feeling, I think. And it's just close to home for people. I mean, those cases, when I teach them in constitutional law, students find it very hard to talk about. So the way I do it is I always teach 2 affirmative action cases, and I just flip the classroom and just make this half is defending affirmative action programs for part of the class, and this half is attacking their constitutionality. Then I flip so that each side, I don't care what you actually believe for purposes of this exercise, you just need to make the arguments on both sides. And you're going to make them on both sides. And that way, whatever comes out of your mouth is what you've been assigned to do, and you at least learn to put yourself in the other side's shoes. Now, you might come back thinking, wow, that was terrible. That argument's even worse than I thought. And I believe even more strongly what I always believe. That's fine. But that's the only way to kind of make it, I think, kind of a safe space where people can say, this is not me talking. This is Professor Blocher told me I had to do it. These are the arguments that the court is having with each other. The justices are having with each other. They're not off the wall arguments. So we got to engage them,
Yeah. Okay. Last question. I promise it's going to be really short. Just yes or no. Do you believe racism exists in the 21st century?
Yes, absolutely. Do I believe racism exists in the 21st century? Yes.
Okay.
That's an easy one.
Okay, so the rest is your time. You have 4 minutes. Say whatever you wish to say. If you don't need to hold 4 minutes, then we'll just end. But I wanted to say before this, once the recording ends and it's converted, I'll send you a link to it. You watch it, and then you'll let me know whether you want me to upload it or not, okay?
That's great. I don't have 4 minutes worth of stuff to say because it would just be me saying thank you for 4 minutes over and over and over again. So thank you, Rochelle. Thanks for doing this series, whatever you're calling it. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of it. I really appreciate it. And I hope that this isn't the last time that we get to have the conversation, whether on Zoom or in person, whatever. Please always feel free to call me.
Absolutely. And you are always welcome to, say, hey, I have some more I want to tell you, or some questions you didn't ask I want to discuss. So anytime, this does not have to be a one-time thing. I leave you with this. If Duke fires me, help me find a job.
I understand. Don't you worry, Rochelle. I'll answer a confident yes to that one too. Promise. I'll be your lawyer, and I'll help you find another job. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Stay well. Tell your wife and your kids 2 now, right?
2 boys.
Yeah, that's right. I remember the one. I just didn't know if you had the second way up. Well, take care of them. Stay safe and remain an advocate for the cause, because we need all the voices we can get.
Hear, hear. Thanks again, Rochelle.
Thank you. Take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Bye.